I personally find logic to be incredibly mysterious. I find it to be mysterious because I don't find it to be an absolute form, but I find it to be a compelling form. The philosopher Immanuel Kant has said about logic that in logic, the question is not of contingent, but of necessary laws. Not how we do think, but how we ought to think. In logic, we do not want to know how the understanding is in thinks, and how it has hitherto proceeded in thinking, but how it ought to proceed in thinking. Its business is to teach us the correct use of reason, that is, the use which is consistent with itself. Now, what I think is that we run into a problem with the claims that logic makes for itself are the presuppositions that logic tries to maintain for itself. I think that logic can properly be defined as an imperative to order. It is really saying, if you want to think with the highest level of intelligence or order, you must do it this way. It is necessary, or else one will end in error. It is necessary, or else one will end in error. I would consider this to be the authority of logic, that logic is actually able to make this claim. That logic is able to say, do it this way, or else you will end in error, in a distortion of your understanding. So that attributes an authority to logic. It infuses logic with authority if the statement that logic makes is correct. If we seek to defy the logical order and we end up believing what is false, then logic does indeed contain an authority. So it's very interesting to think of logic as putting forward an ought or a kind of necessity, so that when logic comes to us and tells us to adopt its particular mode of function, it is telling us, it is warning us that if we do not do this, we will ultimately end in a distortion. This is an incredible power, I think, and a very strong authority. But I don't think that logic occupies the place of an absolute in this sense. I don't think that logic can necessarily posit itself as a form of necessity that is universal in this sense. I think that that is a much harder case to make for logic, to say that here we have a form of order, and that this form of order is universal. It may be the case that this particular order has an authority to it, but I don't know if that authority would automatically make the logic universal. To, once again, quote Kant in this sense, in the logic, the question is not of contingent, but of necessary laws. Not how we do think, but how we ought to think. So in logic, we are making the claim that our thinking should conform to a particular form. And we are saying that it should conform to this because if it doesn't, we end in a distortion. In logic, we do not want to know how the understanding is and thinks and how it has hitherto proceeded in thinking, but how it ought to proceed in thinking. How it ought to proceed. Its business is to teach us the correct use of reason, that is, the use which is consistent with itself. If I take an issue with a word here, it might be the word correct. Correct in the sense that we have landed upon some kind of universal or absolutist principle or concept, when in fact we are simply expounding a procedure of order. So I don't know if the use of the term correct could actually be sustained. I think that it might be more accurate to say that it's the business of logic to teach us to have a more intelligent use of reason, as opposed to a correct or absolute use of reason. But I think logic is mysterious in this sense, because the question remains open to a large degree. We can have the conversation as to whether or not this form of order occupies a place of correctness that has a universality to it. I think that's hard to maintain, and I think that merely stating that it offers us a more intelligent use of formality is enough to sustain the authority of logic. And this is very interesting when we think of logic in terms of dialectic logic, because dialectic logic is making the same claim as general logic, and that is that this is how we ought to think if we don't want to deceive ourselves with our thinking. And dialectic would, in this sense, I believe, imply an advance in logic insofar as it makes a crucial distinction, the distinction of the necessity of thinking in terms of opposition. So the claim with dialectical logic then would be that if we forego this procedure of thinking in terms of opposition, that we would end up being deceived by our thinking. The same claim that is made from general logic. And so, again, there's an authority that dialectic logic has, because if it can sustain this claim, that if we forego opposition, we end in error, then dialectic logic maintains its authority. It can demonstrate its authority. I don't think that this would necessarily mean that it had a universal or correct property to it in a metaphysical or supernatural sense. That's where I would take issue with it. But certainly it can argue that it has a higher intelligence, a higher correctness, a higher accuracy. Simply put, authority. That it is an authoritative form of thought. And so dialectic is not merely making the claim that it is an option to engage in oppositional thinking, but that to think in terms of opposition is necessary to understand reality itself.